All right. Good evening and welcome, everyone. It is a thrill to have you all with us tonight in the American Ancestors Building at 97 Newbury Street. Many of you, a good number of you, I would say 7 times as many of you are online with us this evening. So welcome to you online. I'm Margaret Talcott. I'm Director of Literary Programs here at American Ancestors, and I'm the producer of this American Inspiration Author Series. Again, we're delighted you're with us in the Brew Family Learning Center. Many of you are here for the first time. I heard from some folks that they hadn't wandered in before, so welcome. We are trying a new format tonight for this hybrid event, and Jeffrey and I have been talking about it. It's cutting edge. It's also bleeding edge. So thank you for braving the elements with us here tonight. On your screen is the schedule for our program. Shortly, our featured author, Jeffrey Boutwell, will take over the lectern, and he'll discuss and share images from his new book, Boutwell, Radical Republican and Champion of Democracy. After his solo time, Mr. Boutwell will be joined up front here by our guest moderator, Robert D. Putnam, for further discussion. In the last 15 minutes, we'll be posing questions from the audience, from those of you here and also from those of you online. Please enter your questions into the Q&A button on your screen at home. And again, if you're here, Ginevra and I will get you a mic, and please speak right up. This is really kind of a seminar format for this evening. We've got a nice intimate crowd here. So please, we welcome you engaging in conversation with us in the last third of the program. Tonight's program is being produced and recorded by my colleagues in the Brew Family Learning Center. And those of you who are in the room and also those of you online will get an email that says that the video's live and can be watched again. We do this because of technical problems potentially at home during COVID. A lot of people, struggled on and off of these Zooms. So a video later is a good thing. You're welcome to tune into it again or share it with anyone you want. There's a lot of history that's going to be discussed and a lot to share tonight. Of course, the real education comes, though, from reading tonight's featured work, which I have a dog-eared copy of. And many of us have been enjoying this book and talking about it. If you ordered a book, a copy of Boutwell this evening, you can step over to the table and Jeffrey will sign it and personalize it for you. If you are online tonight and you ordered a book, it will be sent to you with a signed book plate in the next it'll go out soon. It'll go out in the next couple days from here. If you haven't ordered a book yet, you can still do that through our partnering bookstore at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, where Jeffrey's been and many of you have been. It's a great bookstore right in Professor Putnam's hometown. So the chat link for that is gone up, and you can order directly from them. They can send your copies anywhere in the United States, to yourself, to your friend, to a family member. So please order books as you like. Now, moving to introductions, our formal introductions. Jeffrey Boutwell is a writer, historian, and science policy specialist whose 40-year career spanned journalism, government, and international scientific research. Now living in Maryland, he grew up in the Boston area. He has a PhD in political science from MIT, and he worked for many years, some of you who are with us tonight know this, at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in Cambridge. Jeffrey and George Boutwell, this is the subject of tonight's book, they share a common ancestor, which is especially special for us here at a genealogical organization. The indentured servant James Boutwell emigrated in 1632 from England to Salem, Massachusetts, and both our author and the subject of our biography are descended from him. Now about our moderator. Robert D. Putnam is the Malkin Research Professor of Public Policy at Harvard University and a former dean of the John F. Kennedy School of Government. Nationally honored as a leading humanist and a renowned scientist, he has consulted for the last 4 presidents. A tremendous honor. And he has also written 14 books, which is a tremendous accomplishment, especially when you hear these titles. He's the best-selling author of Our Kids and Bowling Alone, and most recently, Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again, a book we all need now. In 2012, President Obama awarded him the National Humanities Medal. Professor Putnam, thank you for the honor of joining us. Yes?
I always say that the first Putnam to arrive was a neighbor, the first Boutwell to arrive in Salem.
Wow. Okay. Wow. Okay. Our seminar continues. Wow. Fascinating. So thank you for that. And now let's get started with our main event. We're thrilled you're here. Welcome to you, Jeffrey.
Great, thank you very much. Those who are here, those who are on Zoom, it's great to be here. Thanks, Margaret. I've watched a lot of these programs on Zoom. I was here in person about a month ago. It's such an honor to be here at American Ancestors and the American Inspiration Author Series. So thank you very much for the opportunity. What I want to do tonight, Bob and I talked about this earlier today. My talks about George Boutwell usually are in three parts. The first one is why I think, and I firmly believe, that George Boutwell was one of the most consequential public figures in American history. The second part of it is, then, if he's so important, why has no one ever heard of him? He's essentially disappeared from the history books for about 100 years. And it's only in the last 20 years that he's been kind of coming out of the shadows. So that's usually the second part of the talk. Why has he been so neglected, so dismissed by American historians? Then the third part is my own kind of journey as to how I came to write the book. I'm a Boutwell, I'm related. What did I know about George growing up in the Boston area? And how did I come to write the book? So what I'm going to do tonight, since we have this wonderful conversation format, is that I will concentrate on the first third, why I think George is so consequential. I'll spend about 15 minutes doing that. Then Bob and I will sit together and he will ask me penetrating questions as to, okay, if he's so important, how come we've not heard of him before? Why was he neglected and dismissed by American historians for such a long, long period? And then I can finish with just a little personal anecdotes as to how I came to write about George in the first place. So, most consequential political figure Americans have never heard of. Two main reasons I give. One is his longevity in public affairs. There aren't many American public figures who were on the scene, intimately involved for 65 years. The first president George ever met was Martin Van Buren in 1839. The last one he came face to face with was Teddy Roosevelt in 1904. In between that, 1839 and 1904, George was active in Massachusetts politics in the 1840s, then the youngest ever governor of Massachusetts in the 1850s, then intimately involved with both Lincoln and Grant during the Civil War and Reconstruction period, led the impeachment of Andrew Johnson in the 1860s, even after leaving the US Senate in 1877. Imagine this, George grew up in a farming family in central Massachusetts, never went to high school, never finished really the 6th grade. He was self-educated. In 1877, when he leaves the Senate, President Rutherford B. Hayes asks him to rewrite and update the entire US legal code. He worked on that for a year, updating and modernizing the legal code for someone who had never gone to high school, much less college or law school. He was offered cabinet positions by President Arthur, turned them down to do international legal work. And then in a quite remarkable third act to his career, in 1898, right after the Spanish-American War, which as we remember was very brief, in 6 months, Admiral Dewey had sunk the Spanish fleet in the Bay of Manila. At the end of the Spanish-American War, George is asked to become the president of the Anti-Imperialist League to combat and oppose the annexation of the Philippines, being led first by McKinley, then by Teddy Roosevelt. And he did that for the final 7 years of his life. In his 80s, finally dying at the age of 87 in his home in Groton, Massachusetts in 1905. So a quite distinguished career, working and knowing almost every president from 1839 to 1904. Even more than the longevity, though, it's the breadth and depth of George's expertise in American public life. Again, I would make the claim that not many American public servants have been as well-versed and as expert in the three major, what I consider the three major areas of American public policy. One is domestic politics and civil rights. Second, economics and finance. Third is foreign affairs. In civil rights and domestic policy, he worked on those issues in the 1840s as a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, then as a governor for 2 years. But it's really when he's appointed by Abraham Lincoln to be the first commissioner of internal revenue and goes on the national scene that he becomes involved in Washington politics and national politics. And then in the House of Representatives from 1863 to 69 as a member of the House Judiciary Committee and the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, helps frame and enact both the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, leads the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, and then finally in the 1870s, working with Ulysses Grant to protect the gains of Reconstruction. When they were under threat by white supremacists in the South, George battled for the national government to continue to protect individual liberties in the South through the end of his Senate career in 1877. That's his essentially, 30, 40 years working on domestic issues and civil rights. Then economic policy and finance. I mentioned he was appointed by Lincoln as the first commissioner of revenue in 1862. Had the incredibly important job of raising the money needed for the Union war effort during the dark days of the Civil War in 1862-63. George Boutwell arrived to work at the IRS, which of course today is somewhat of a dirty word, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. He establishes the IRS office in the basement of the Treasury in July of 1862. He's initially given 3 staff to interpret a 20,000 word tax code that Congress had just passed to raise revenue for the Civil War. 9 months later, when he leaves IRS to go into the House, IRS consists of 3,000 tax assessors and collectors all throughout the northern states and the border states to raise the needed revenue for Union troops for the Civil War. It was a Herculean effort, 7 days a week, often well into the evening. He worked in the Treasury Department right next to the White House. He would often walk over and talk to Lincoln about, appointing new tax assessors and collectors. But they forged a special bond during that period too. Lincoln would ask George his opinion about how the war was going. Lincoln always loved to ask everybody their opinion about how the war was going. Which Union general should I sack and which one should I appoint? But he and George got to see each other quite often through 1862 into 1863 and talk about the war. And Lincoln came to rely on his advice. So with that experience in 1862-63, when Ulysses Grant is elected president in 1868, he appoints George his Secretary of the Treasury. George serves for 4 years until 1873, and at a quite momentous time. The Civil War is only 4 years old. There are too many greenbacks in circulation. Inflation is running rampant, as happens in every American military conflict. They have to spend a lot of money to support the troops, but that feeds inflation. George had the job of bringing inflation down, restoring America's credit with its overseas trading partners, taking greenbacks out of circulation, and putting the American currency back on a solid gold standard. And he did that in 4 years for Ulysses Grant. So that's his expertise in economics and finance. And then finally, in foreign policy, it's really in the 1870s that he starts to get into international legal issues. He's appointed by Hayes and Arthur to serve on commissions dealing with France, Chile, Haiti, and other countries. He is hired by the Kingdom of Hawaii in 1885 to represent their interests in Congress. So he's becoming well-versed in international legal affairs, but it's really only after the Spanish-American War when the the first really mass public anti-war movement in this country was formed to oppose McKinley's and Roosevelt's annexation of the Philippines, with people like Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, Jane Addams of Hull House, Booker T. Washington, and W.E.B. Du Bois, an incredibly varied constellation of people who coalesced to oppose American imperialism overseas. And the person they asked to be their president is George Boutwell, out of the office in Boston. And he does that for the remaining 7 years of his life. So really, to a distinguished career, incredibly expert. I could mention his passion for public education. He was secretary of the Board of Education in Massachusetts, wrote a big treatise on education that is still available today. He was just an intellectual glutton. He really wanted to know everything about everything, self-educated like Lincoln, staying up until the early hours of the morning when he was working as a teenager in a dry goods store in Groton. So how did he get to Washington? With apologies to Jimmy Stewart and Mr. Smith goes to Washington, George was born in 1818 in Brookline, Massachusetts, on property that currently is the Country Club of Brookline, the golf course of the Country Club of Brookline. His father at the time was managing a farm for a wealthy landowner, didn't even own the farm himself, but 2 years later had saved enough money that he moved his family to Lunenburg, Massachusetts, in central Massachusetts, bought a farm within sight of Mount Wachusett, and that's where George grew up. Grew up a farming boy in central Massachusetts, working on the farm. They had fruit trees and livestock. And essentially that was his education, in addition to going to a common school, but only in the wintertime because he was needed to work on the farm in the summer. And so he had that education up until about age 8 or 9 years old, when he then was apprenticed to a local dry goods store owner in Lunenburg, did that for several years, and then made what I consider to be one of the most important decisions in his life. At the age of 17, he decided to move to Groton, Mass. For those who know Groton, it's a little bit west of Concord, Mass. At the time, it probably was the most intellectually important town west of Boston. Obviously, Concord was first with the Transcendentalists and Margaret Fuller and Emerson and Thoreau and whatnot. But Groton had a thriving intellectual community, a thriving anti-slavery community in the 1830s that George joined and learned about slavery, anti-slavery issues. And he apprenticed with local lawyers to learn the law. So he's doing that as a teenager, has his first visit to Washington, D.C. in 1839. He's just turned 20 years old. He meets Martin Van Buren, as I mentioned, at the White House. But one of the seminal episodes of his life, he's out walking in Washington on a Sunday morning down by where the National Mall is today, and he goes by something called the Yellow House. That is one of the slave pens that was prominent in Washington at the time, where slaves were bought, stored, and then sold or transported down the river to Louisiana, Mississippi, to the cotton plantations, the sugar cane plantations. And when he's walking by this slave pen, he meets an elderly woman whose daughter has been separated from her, is being sold down the river to Louisiana. This woman is totally distraught and inconsolable. And it makes a real impression on George as a 20-year-old to meet an elderly woman whose daughter has been ripped away from the family and is being sold down south. So he still is in Groton. He marries Sarah Thayer from Hollis, New Hampshire, southern New Hampshire. They begin to raise a family, have a daughter, Georgiana, a son, Francis. George is serving 7 terms in the Massachusetts House at this point, traveling into Boston to Beacon Hill to serve in the House. But most importantly, by the early 1850s, George had originally been a Democrat because he's a farmer. He's in favor of labor issues, working man's issues, whatnot. But at the time, of course, the Democrats are controlled by Southern Democrats who are pro-slavery. And increasingly, George cannot stand being a Democrat where the National Party is defending slavery and advocating that it be extended into the Western territories. So he leaves the Democratic Party And with others like Charles Francis Adams in Boston, he creates the Republican Party in Massachusetts in the mid-1850s, and then at a national level, such that he goes to the 1860 National Convention in Chicago that nominated Lincoln, easily one of the most momentous in American history. And because of his committeeship skills, his writing skills, there were probably 400 delegates there. George is one of 7 delegates asked to be on the drafting committee for the party platform. He joined Horace Greeley from the New York Tribune and others to actually draft the Republican Party platform in 1860 that Lincoln ran on and was elected on. So that's where he first meets Lincoln shortly after the convention. And then in early 1861, just a month before Lincoln is inaugurated, the country is hurtling towards civil war. South Carolina and 6 other states have already seceded from the Union. George plays a prominent role in the Virginia Peace Convention, which was held at the Willard Hotel in Washington, and again meets Lincoln when, if you remember the famous story, Lincoln arrives incognito at the train station in Washington because of threats of assassination coming down from Philadelphia and Baltimore. And he sees George later that day at the Willard Hotel, and that further bonds their relationship and is one of the reasons that Lincoln picked George to be his revenue commissioner in 1862. So that's essentially how George got to Washington and how he began his career. I'll just end this brief overview of his career. I think this is the core of George Boutwell's career and his service to the country and his contribution to America. He was in Washington from 1862 to 1877, Revenue Commissioner, U.S. House, Treasury Secretary, U.S. Senate, working on those fundamentally important aspects of America's civil rights policy. The 14th and 15th Amendments, working with Grant on the KKK Enforcement Act in 1871, which at least for a short period dispersed the Klan in South Carolina and broke up the white vigilante groups that were seeking to block civil rights in the South. And then finally, in the US Senate in 1876, the country at this point, it's celebrating its 100th birthday in 1876. Most Northerners are getting tired of Reconstruction, so-called Reconstruction fatigue. Grant does not have the political support he had had previously to continue to enforce rights in the South through the US military, through local government officials. The Klan is making a resurgence. Other white vigilante groups, they're whipping and intimidating and injuring Black voters and their white supporters. And almost nobody cares in the country. Reconstruction is about to die. But George Boutwell wouldn't get up the fight. He wrote this 1876 Mississippi report that documented violence and intimidation that was being carried out in the South. He traveled to Mississippi, took testimony, firsthand testimony from injured parties and witnesses and whatnot, and produced a 2,000-page report that is still available on the web, easily available. Just Google 1876 Mississippi report, and it's a testament to how Reconstruction and the Reconstruction policies of Grant were undermined and ultimately overthrown by the white Democratic Party in the South, which, as we all know, then went on to overthrow all of the Southern state governments. That was followed by Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, separate but equal, and the installation of Jim Crow laws that characterized the American South and many parts of the North as well, up until the 1950s. But George wouldn't give up the fight even as Reconstruction was dying. So I will end there, and that's my kind of spiel as to why I think George Boutwell deserves a lot more respect than he has gotten in the past. And now Bob will join me to, we'll talk about, okay, if he's, so important to American history, how come nobody has ever heard of him until now? Yeah.
Yeah, now, remember to turn on my mic. Remember how to turn on my mic. Is it on?
Think so? Yep.
That's good. Well, let's pick up right where you left off, Jeffrey. And that is, why is he so ignored and dismissed?
I make the case in the book that he was considered to be on the losing side of four major episodes in American history. One is the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, which for many, many years was seen as kind of an extra legal attempt by fanatic Republicans to remove a sitting president for no good constitutional reason. That view has been changing in the past 20 years with books by Brenda Wineapple and David Stewart and others. Yes, George he had a bit between his teeth, and he hated Andrew Johnson with a passion for, blocking what he thought was the development of an American multiracial society, which is what the Civil War was all about. So George, yes, he went to no length, or he spared no measures to implicate Andrew Johnson and try and get him out of office. But nonetheless, that changed. The historical opinion of the impeachment process has been changing. Much more important is Ulysses S. Grant. As we all know, Grant has been seen as one of the worst presidents up until about 20 years ago. He was considered to be a drunkard, corrupt, political neophyte. He endured the scorn of, Boston elites like Henry Adams and others who just castigated poor Ulysses as being totally out of his depth as president of the United States. Again, in the last 20 years, we've had major revisions of that viewpoint. Ron Chernow's biography. Most importantly, I'd mention Charles Calhoun, the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. So the Grant opinion or the view of Grant has been changing, and George was so close to Grant and such a strong political ally that he suffered for many years being so closely identified with Ulysses Grant. Third was anti-imperialism. Many at the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century and into the 20th century saw the Anti-Imperialist League as a bunch of old fogies, out of touch with a dynamic America, representative of the 1800s and not the dynamism of the 1900s and personified by Teddy Roosevelt. Well, that all may be true, but annexation of the Philippines and the terribly brutal war that America conducted there that led to 5,000 American soldiers dying and 200,000 Filipinos, in many ways was a precursor 60 years later of Vietnam, and obviously been seen in a different light because of that. Most importantly is lost cause historiography, the view of Reconstruction, the fact that Southern white historians or even Northern historians kind of pushed the view that the South had been terribly mistreated after the Civil War. The federal government had imposed Black civil rights at the point of the bayonet, that it was overweening federal power that had intruded on states' rights in the South. That was the dominant narrative for 70, 80 years up until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Ergo, again, George suffered because of that viewpoint.
Well, there's a lot to talk about, and I want to turn now to your assessment of his greatest successes and greatest failures. I may not agree on that actually. So, but I've learned from your book. Go ahead. What do you think of as his greatest successes?
Well, I think his greatest achievement is the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. George was a wonderful negotiator, conciliator in Congress. His skills were evident in the passage both of the 14th and 15th Amendments. You got people like Charles Sumner, who thought they didn't go far enough to finally say, this is all we can achieve at the moment. Northern white opinion is not ready for Black civil equality. We can go this far, but no further. And at least they got the 14th Amendment passed, and then the 15th. The final little piece that I'll read at the end of the night is, George felt a fundamental flaw of the Constitution was too much power given to the state governments, that it allowed slavery to exist prior to the Civil War, it would cause the Civil War with secession, and that only using the power of the national government to protect individual liberties, no matter where people might live, was the answer to that. So
it's hard to disagree with that claim because race itself is so fundamental to American history, going way back. Although I wonder what you think of an alternative case that I'll put forward. I think that his financial reforms and financial expertise especially during the period when he was Secretary of the Treasury, was astonishing and very foresighted. He's in general remarkably foresighted. But one example of that is way before people were talking about there being a need for a national bank, which became the Fed, the Federal Reserve Board, which is now crucial to what we were seeing this almost every day now, how important the Fed is to the macroeconomic development of the United States. He saw the need way back then, what, 50 years earlier than it was, if it was created in 1916, something like that. This is essentially a half century before we finally got around to instituting that. Anyway, I'm giving you a chance to have a counter
example.
Yeah.
It's interesting that as I was first getting into the rehabilitation of George's reputation in this country, back in the 1980s and 90s, the first people who recognized his worth to the country were the economists and more conservative historians who may not have liked his Reconstruction policies, but they loved what he did as Secretary of the Treasury for U.S. Grant, and even before as Revenue Commissioner for Lincoln.
Sure.
Those people started to sing George's praises before we even get to the Ron Chernows and the new looks of Reconstruction.
You mentioned this in passing in your opening remarks, but it was quite remarkable that he was having to tread a very close line in the post-war period between trying to restabilize American national finances, but also not cause a too quick adjustment to hard money. And it's a remarkable feat, actually. Let me ask you about his greatest failures. What are they?
I kind of prefigured that a little bit in my talks about impeachment. Most people would say impeachment had been a failure. Johnson wasn't convicted. He stayed in office. My argument to that, my answer to that is that the impeachment process greatly limited Johnson's freedom of maneuver in the last year of his presidency. He had been vetoing congressional bills left and right. By the time you get to the spring of 1868, he's a wounded president. He tried to run for president in 1868 on the Democratic Party, but they didn't want him because they saw him as damaged goods because of the impeachment process. So even though impeachment itself wasn't successful, I think the campaign or the arguments that people were making as to why Johnson should be impeached had a positive effect in limiting his effectiveness. Well, now, it's also true that George just went totally overboard.
Exactly. Fanatic.
Yeah, he was. He really he hated Johnson with a passion. And nothing was too extreme to be visited on the head of Andrew Johnson, even to the point where George really went off the rails. And it's kind of a wonderful story. He tried to implicate Johnson in the assassination of President Lincoln. About a year after Lincoln died in 1866, George and a few other people are making the argument that Johnson had conspired with Jefferson Davis and the Confederate leadership to kill Abraham Lincoln in the waning days of the Civil War so that Johnson could become president and take Reconstruction in a new direction.
There's another possible episode in his career where you could imagine people making a claim that he went astray. Actually, I'm not sure I agree with that, and that is he was in charge of the country's finances for Grant in a regime that was notoriously corrupt. I agree that there's been, and I think long overdue, a revaluation of Grant. But now, if you go back to that, there was something to the whole.
There was corruption, no question about it.
And he being Boutwell, sort of avoided criticism of his own role, though what do you think about that, his role in that in the so-called corrupt.
Corrupting. One, George was, no scandal ever came close to touching him in terms of having profited personally.
Right.
More than that, there was something back then called the moiety system, M-O-I-E-T-Y, by which if you were a treasury agent and you went out and you collected back taxes from somebody, you would get 50% of the proceeds. Or if you, tracked down a moonshiner and they paid a fine, your bonus would be 50% of whatever the reward was. Well, of course, that just opens the door for corruption, increasing or inflating the amount of money that you say you've brought in. George hated the moiety system, and he convinced Grant to insert that into one of his presidential messages to Congress to get rid of it, and ultimately it was.
So let me change the subject just a little bit. It's an aspect of this story that you underplay, probably correctly, but this is an incredibly timely. I mean, there are so many parallels between the issues that Boutwell was dealing with and our own times. I mean, like today. And this whole last couple of, you are aware that we've been going through difficult times as a country over the last several weeks, several months, right? So let me just kick off some, and then I want to have you reflect on whether they're issues of race. We've already talked about, central to him, central to our time, central to almost all American history. Issues of immigration, which are central to our time, and you've not played up that, but he was both in Massachusetts and in his later career, he was very involved in immigration. And cultural identity was an important issue, which it is right now. That is, if you think about the Trump's base, a lot of that is not just about economics, it's do you see me?
Right.
And that issue of cultural identity is important now, was important then, and constitutional law, of course, and the role of the presidency. Even appears in this story, and we will all remember it from January 9th, the issue of whether, I guess it was Lincoln, would be confirmed by the Congress after the votes were all brought to. And then it's a period of party realignment. We don't know whether this is a period of party realignment, but that's what's, I mean, you could easily describe what we're going through now as the beginnings of a period of party realignment. And birthright citizenship. Remember, that's the issue, whether if you're just born here, you're a citizen. That's embodied in the Constitution, but the issue was being debated then. And not least, the issue of the civil service. He was an early advocate of civil service reform. Have you heard that there's some recent debate about whether we should replace civil servants with political appointees? Boutwell was there on all of these issues. Anyway, I'm curious about your reflections on.
Let's start with the last one first, civil service. That's one of the issues that Grant and Boutwell took most heat from by the so-called liberal Republicans back at the time, Henry Adams, Charles Francis Adams, the Boston elite, Horace Greeley, and people like that. Oh, Grant is giving jobs to all of his friends and, not doing it on merit, which is absolutely untrue. They did do it on merit. Yes, there was a patronage system, as there always is in politics. If you're a Republican, then you're going to be, appointing mainly Republican, supporters to jobs. But as long as they're qualified to take those jobs, then that should be fine. But George did argue for civil service, and Grant did too, well before civil service was finally enacted in 1883.
Right. Any of the others that I mentioned?
Birthright citizenship. George, as I said, he was a main author of the 14th Amendment, in which birthright citizenship is contained. Back then, birthright citizenship was extended to every child born on American soil except for three categories. First category were the sons and daughters of diplomats. If you're the son of a Swedish ambassador, of course you shouldn't get citizenship. Second was an interesting category of military personnel on American soil. And any children born to them of a foreign nature should not get citizenship. George talked about birthright citizenship and said these words were chosen with care. In that sense, he was an originalist. And originalism now is thought to be very much a conservative judicial philosophy, but it can work both ways. And he argued for an original reading of birthright citizenship, which of course is not being done today by those who would like to change it.
No, it'll be before the Supreme Court for sure,
Yeah.
back again.
Yeah.
So let me turn, well, it's more an observation on my part, but then there will be a question. I love this book, but one reason that I like it is that it has a lot of what I would call peripheral vision. That is, I like reading biographies, but I mean, historical biographies, but I especially like historical biographies that are constantly telling you about what else is happening in the country at the same time, so that you're not just getting a story of a particular woman or man, but you're getting a story of their times and the interaction between their times. Well, this Boutwell's book about that Boutwell is an ideal case of that. I mean, if you've not read it, I urge you to read it for that alone. It's also very well written. I can't really ask a question about that. But here's the question that I want to ask, and then I'm sort of moving toward the time when people can raise questions. I have no idea where we are in the overall.
We on time?
Great, you
Good.
have time for one or two more for sure.
Good, okay.
Okay. I've got 7 more, but I will, let me finish this one and then maybe I'll have time for one more. It seems to me, I've never written biographies. I'd like to actually, because I think it's a really important genre. But I can't imagine the kind of work that's in. So I'm asking you a methodological question. How did you do that? I mean, it isn't just you're looking up archives about Boutwell, but it's not in those archives that you're going to learn that at the same time. I'll give you one example that you've already heard. That's why I'm giving it to you. The encounter in his first trip to Washington that Boutwell has with the slave pens and the Yellow House, is that what it was called?
Yellow House.
Sort of roughly where the Air and Space Museum is now, or in Washington. And you've described the episode in which Boutwell observes the pen and then observes this woman who's crying for her daughter, and actually in the story, it's such a cliffhanger that I kept hoping, well, maybe if the daughter was going to be saved, that would be the kind of happy ending of this, but she's not.
No happy ending.
So now think of that as one example among thousands in this book, in which you're learning not just about Boutwell, but you're learning about what's going on, and you're given a taste, but typically more than a taste, of what other things were happening. What was the context within which Boutwell is operating? So that's what I admire so much. And the methodological question is, how do you do that? It can't be in Boutwell's own archives. So what do you do?
Right. I guess that when I started this in March of 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, I'd had some other projects going on in retirement. They got cut off because of COVID, so I turned to this. And I started educating myself on the history of the time, and I'll give 2 brief examples. They're not brief because they're both 600 or 700 page books, but they really helped me frame the period. One is Richard White's The Republic for Which It Stands, A History of the Gilded Age in America.
Right.
And the other, of course, is the classic Eric Foner, Reconstruction.
Yeah, right.
And to understand both of those periods, those are 2 of the books you have to start with. And I kind of just immersed myself in those kinds of histories, while at the same time looking at George's papers and learning more about him as an individual.
Still, if you go back to that episode, one episode that I've described of this, where does that appear? That's not in Foner. That's not in.
That's his memoirs, yeah.
Oh, I see.
In
It's
George's
in George's
memoirs.
memoirs.
Yeah.
Good. I will mention the other question, but it's me. This is an observation that I'm interested in. Not. We all know the Progressive Era, which is the period, roughly speaking. George himself is too old and dies sort of before the real progressive era starts. That's the period from, roughly speaking, 1900 to 1910 or thereabouts. I think it's one of the most interesting periods in American history. But this is, and the book, The Upswing, that somebody mentioned as a book of mine, is largely about that period. Sorry, this is not about my book, but about this. But in that book, I've come to the conclusion that that was a model for us. That is, that progressive era, we need a new progressive era, I believe. But what I was struck by in your book, to go now back to your book, and then we'll turn it over for questions. In his early years, George seems to me to be taking part in a similar kind of progressive era. Nobody's called it that, and I'm not suggesting that we should talk about progressive era 0 as opposed to the real progressive era and then what I hope for is the new progressive era. In many ways, I don't know whether it's Massachusetts or whether it's Boutwell himself, is at that point raising many of the same issues that later on get picked up. First of all, the connection between the world of the mind and the world of politics. That's what he was, a classic New England, political intellectual, so to speak. Education was very important in that period, as it was in that period. The progressive educational move was the creation of the common school across, essentially elementary school. In the second period, the major innovation is high schools. Public high schools were basically invented in America in the second progressive era. You can see it in, well, I won't keep going on, but there are many, many examples in the 1830-1840 period of Boutwell in the lead, but Massachusetts in general, making substantial progress, not on race, of course, but on substantial progress on all these other social issues. What's your view about that?
I'll go back to what I said about his moving to Groton in 1835. It was one of the best decisions he ever made. He knew Margaret Fuller. They overlapped in Groton for several years. They were both Sunday school teachers in the same First Parish Church. He was exposed to the transcendentalist thought of Fuller and Emerson and Thoreau and whatnot. Just as important, exposed to the anti-slavery societies of the 1830s and early 1840s, reading the works of Garrison and Wendell Phillips and people like that. In the early 1840s, George kind of combined his business acumen with his politics when he and a friend in Groton bought something called Liberty Hall, which had been the site of anti-slavery lectures, including by Frederick Douglass in the early 1830s. They bought that, moved it to the center of town, and continued to have it be the venue for anti-slavery meetings on the second floor, while the first floor were kind of shops and whatnot that could make some money for the venture. But he was involved in those types of issues, as you say, temperance, shorter worker hours for the mill workers of Lawrence and Lowell, things like that. And he very much, was part of the ferment, the progressive ferment of the 1830s and 40s.
Well, I'll put it this way, we in Middlesex County have a lot to be proud of. And you have a lot to be proud of your ancestor and of this book.
Thank you.
Now,
We can.
we do have some audience questions, which is, and thank you both very much. I can't agree with you heartily enough about how remarkable it is to read histories with context that gives you context into your family's history. To understand a certain time period so well is each time I dip into this book, I pick up another piece of history from another time period. It's really a remarkable work. So, and we have questions for both of you, but I will start with one from the audience, virtual audience. It sounds as though Boutwell did not visibly contend with other members of Grant's administration who were corrupt. Is there evidence that he may have privately remarked, e.g. to Grant himself, about those responsible for the corruption?
Indeed, he did. George was not shy about singling out members of the administration who were corrupt. Biggest example I give in the book is a guy named Alfred Pleasanton. Pleasanton was a Civil War general, a colleague of Grant's, and yes, Grant had a weakness for appointing his, general colleagues from the Civil War into
Cronies.
positions in cronies into the 1870s. Pleasanton was appointed commissioner of the IRS in the 1870s, the job that George had had 10 years before. But of course, George is now Secretary of the Treasury, so he's Pleasanton's boss, and he hated the appointment from day one. And he repeatedly went to Grant and said, this guy is both, inefficient and inept, but also corrupt. You got to get rid of him. Grant was loyal to a fault, and often to a great fault. And it took repeated visits by George to finally get Grant to agree to fire, Alfred Pleasanton. So he identified individuals and pockets of malfeasance in Washington that he saw.
Another question here. It seems to me that the party in power right now is using the Reconstruction playbook, banning book bannings, official state curricula that would not mention anything that put the Confederacy in bad light, limiting voting rights, cries of socialism, communism, fake news. I have not read the plan for 2020. I wonder if that's based on the playbook for Reconstruction as well.
2025, I think.
2025, I'm
25,
sorry,
yeah.
yes. This is your comment about today and the parallels today. So when you wrote this book, tell us what you were seeing and how, what drove you to go back to that? Was there any insight you wanted to bring to us, or is this accidental?
I think just to illuminate a period of history where people like George and Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses Grant were their adherence and their faith in the Constitution. Lincoln is famous for saying the Constitution was his civil religion. That's what was the bedrock of American rights and liberties, equality of opportunity that came about after the Civil War. George felt the same way, and that we're a nation of laws, not of men. Men come and go, but the laws have to be respected, have to be interpreted in terms of how they were thought of at the time for the benefit of the people that they were, decided for.
And a question here from a Brookline person. Tell us how you came upon Brookline history. What sort of access did you have to archives? How did you do the research you did for Brookline?
In terms of where George was born in 1818. I did have a lot of help. I have to give great credit to a guy named Thomas H. Brown. Only 3 treatments of George were ever written up until mine. One was Thomas H. Brown. He wrote a PhD thesis in the 1980s using the papers in Groton, George's papers at the Groton Historical Society. And he talked about Brookline and George having been born on a farm in Brookline. So then I was able to track down exactly where it was and its connection to the country club. In addition to that, there was a modest article in the New England Quarterly earlier. But one thing I really want to mention, this is one of the biggest revelations I had in the book, and I think it speaks volumes about George. In 1933, there was a young African-American historian, Benjamin Arthur Quarles, who shows up in Wisconsin wanting to do history, graduate work. And at Wisconsin in the 1930s, he wants to start writing about Black Americans and their contributions to Black society, so-called Black agency. And if you can believe it, in 1933, but maybe you can believe it because it's 1933, he was told by his white thesis advisors, "Sir, you can't write about a Black person. One, there's not enough primary source material for a good historical analysis of a Black person. Even more condescending, we're not sure that Blacks can be objective in writing about other Blacks." This was what
Unlike us
Quarles,
whites writing about other whites.
exactly, and he had to write about a white, and he picked George Boutwell as kind of the best exemplar of Black agency, of someone who had fought for Black suffrage, Black public school education during the Reconstruction era. And so I owe a lot to Benjamin Quarles. I got a copy of his 120-page master's thesis from Wisconsin, and it was quite a revelation to have found that.
So we have some others online, but I think we may have a few in the audience, please. We welcome any questions. Go ahead, Greg.
So, what's the story with the house in Groton owned by the Historical Society? I've driven by it numerous times. Was it his country house like a lot of wealthy people in that time period?
No, it was not a country house. That was his main residence, and George was anything but wealthy. He came from a farming family. He did have a farm in Groton, 300 acres. And remember back then, congressmen, they had to make a living. They didn't make a living by being a congressman. So he continued his legal practice. He operated his farm when he was back home in Groton. He built it in 1851. It's now the Governor Boutwell House, the home of the Groton Historical Society. Anyone can go visit it. That's where his papers are. And it's a nice looking house, but it is not ornate or luxurious by any matter of means, and certainly not up to the scale of the Adams and Lowells and Cabots of Beacon Hill.
Right, and the Otises and those guys. And like all the Otises and all those guys, all
Otises,
those fancy
right.
guys who are
Right.
on Beacon Hill.
Yeah.
Another question right there?
Could you tell us a bit about his anti-imperialism views? And was that something that you would have seen coming from a younger George Boutwell? Or was it a bit of a surprise that he ended up there?
Not a total surprise. He had been against American annexation. I mean, Cuba, remember, throughout most of the 1800s, Americans lusted after Cuba. Beginning in the 1830s and 40s, they wanted to make it another state, especially the slave power in the South, because they wanted to make it a slave state that would add to their power in Washington, D.C. and Congress. George was against that. He was against the annexation of Hawaii. He represented the Kingdom of Hawaii, but he thought, and Andrew Carnegie agreed totally with this, that we can get all the benefits of trade with Hawaii without formally annexing it and establishing a military control over it. So he had that streak in him even prior to 1898 and the anti-imperialist campaign that he then led.
But how old is he at that point? I mean,
80. He's
what is
80
he
years
doing?
old.
I mean, he's
He-
old. Come on.
He's in semi-retirement. He's living in Groton. He's a regular columnist for the Boston Globe, writing on a wide range of topics. He continues to consult in Washington and do a little bit of legal work, but he's semi-retired at 80 years old.
But what's
and
he,
they
okay,
come-
I got it that
They
he's
come
opposed to
knocking
it.
on his door.
Yeah, but why is he becoming an activist? I mean, I can imagine, I'm 84, I can imagine getting upset about something, but
Yeah.
I can't imagine actually organizing.
It was
against
it was his passion. And as we've talked about, his passion sometimes led him to, fanaticism even, but it was absolutely his passion.
Amazing.
And to kind of finish that question, his main beef with the annexation of the Philippines was that we were trampling on the rights of individual Filipinos. He believed the Constitution should follow the flag. If we're going to establish physical control over a foreign territory, be it the Philippines, be it Puerto Rico, be it whatever, we should give those people the rights as contained in the Constitution, and we should at least give them the promise of eventual statehood. Of course, we've seen what's happened with Puerto Rico for the last 120 years and how far that has not gone. But he really felt that America was essentially engaging in nothing terribly different than the slavery of the antebellum period in violating the rights of American blacks by going to the Philippines and violating the rights of the Philippines in suppressing their desire for independence.
Another question.
Thank you. This is a remarkable talk. I'm curious about Mr. Boutwell's service in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, where I worked for over a decade, as well as his service as governor. You noted he was the youngest governor in the history of the Commonwealth. Can you elaborate on maybe some policies or incidents that happened during his tenure as governor, and how did he, as a self-taught man, become the youngest governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts?
Some really fun stories there. If I hadn't mentioned it before, I did. I think George started off as a Democrat. He was a working man's party Democrat, so he served as a Democrat in the Massachusetts House in the 1840s. Ergo, he was in favor of a 10-hour, working day. At the time, it was unlimited. Mill owners could make their employees work as long as they wanted. He advocated for a 10-hour working day, the secret ballot, so that mill owners wouldn't be able to pressure their employees to vote the way they wanted through an open ballot and know how they voted. He was for the secret ballot, 10-hour law. He served on transportation and banking committees as well, passionate about public education. George helped found the Salem Normal School up in Salem, Massachusetts, the first women's high school in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in 1857. So passionate about public education. I've always been very proud of the fact that as chair of the Mass Board of Education, he followed Horace Mann, essentially the dean, the father of
Right.
American public education. So education, those domestic issues that he was involved with, as I said, he increasingly became disillusioned with the Democrats because of their support for slavery at the national level. He became governor of 1851 through a marvelous coalition of Democrats and the Free Soil Party at the time, Charles Francis Adams, those Whigs who were disaffected by Whig policies on slavery. They came together in the Republican Party and overthrew the Whig domination of the state government. And that's essentially how he became governor in 1851.
There is one thing that's important in the book, and you might mention, and that is he was not so advanced on the role of women. And
That's putting it mildly.
but then you ought to also tell about his relationship with his daughter, which is an
Daughter,
important part of the story.
Right. And I'm always remiss. I never talk about Georgie Boutwell, his daughter, Georgiana, as much as I like or I should, a marvelous individual. And I think I do her justice in the book.
Yeah,
with
but-
a lot of anecdotes, had the relationship she forged with Ulysses Grant, with the Grant family. She visited Grant in April of 1885, just months before Grant died of throat cancer, was a very good friend of the Grant families, but also was her father's helpmeet for more than 25 years.
Right.
She lived with him in Washington. She helped him politically. She would go to functions with him, to dinner with William Seward or William Tecumseh Sherman or whoever they were having dinner with that evening. And she really was his companion in Washington but also developed her own personality. And just a wonderful individual.
And nudging him a little bit on the issue of
Suffrage. Yes.
Women's suffrage, right?
Right, yeah. And she pushed him, but George was only late in life did he come out in favor of women's suffrage.
Could we assume that somebody like Georgie was educated?
She had a good education. She went to Lawrence Academy in Groton, and then public school as well. She went to the Salem Normal School in the late 1850s that her father had helped establish. So she was well educated, wonderful writer. There are 3 memoirs of hers out in Groton that I was able to read that filled in a lot of blanks in George's career.
And can we also be thinking that Groton and Concord were some sort of bubble at that point of intellectual fervor?
They were.
I mean, when
And-
you looked out to New York, you looked out to other Seneca Falls, you looked to that region. Were there similar bubbles that you saw, or was it a unique thing?
No, similar bubbles,
Mhm.
where the transcendentalist movement especially had taken root in the Lyceum,
Mhm.
the network of public education circles all throughout the North that Emerson helped foster and whatnot.
All right, do we have any other questions from,
I'll
Yeah,
ask
please.
a question. I sort of wondered, do you place George as a fairly typical politician of the time, broadly well-learned, applying his intellect to finance, to the rights of people, to the Constitution, or was there something unusual about him and how broadly he applied himself and how successful or involved he was
Big
across
softball.
these?
Totally unique. There was nobody like him. No. Very different in the sense that one, as I said, he was an intellectual glutton. He was like Lincoln. He would stay up until 2 o'clock in the morning as a teenager reading constitutional law, political philosophy, all aspects of business and economics. He started writing at a very early age for some of the major publications in the North and around the country. He was a little bit lucky in terms of being in the right place at the right time to be appointed to offices where he could learn new skills. And the biggest example of that is becoming Secretary of the Treasury. That was a total accident. Grant was elected 1868, is about to be inaugurated 1869. First person he chooses as secretary is Alexander Stewart, a wealthy department store owner in New York. Well, people like Charles Sumner raised all kinds of objections over conflict of interest. We don't want a businessman running the Treasury Department. So that was shot down, and Grant is literally days away from being inaugurated. He still doesn't have a Secretary of the Treasury, but he knows George well enough at this point, trusts him, knows of his experience as governor of Massachusetts and as commissioner of revenue, and says, George, I really need your help. You know, I want you to become my Secretary of the Treasury. There's a wonderful letter from George back home to his wife, Sarah, saying, you won't have heard of this, and I know you're going to be disappointed, but I can't let Grant down. I have to take this job as Secretary of the Treasury. Think of what that meant for him at the time. He was in the House of Representatives. They only met for 2 or 3 months a year. He could go home in the spring, you know, tend to his farm all summer long into the fall, have a normal life until going back to Washington in December. If you're Secretary of the Treasury, you don't get to do that. You're in Washington 12 months a year, running the nation's finances, the largest department in the federal government, thousands of employees. But he just, you know, agreed to do it for what he thought was the good of Grant and the good of the country. So things like that were kind of serendipitous in terms of getting new skills. But nonetheless, George, he just applied himself to everything that came along. And people are probably, who've heard this before, are getting tired of it, but I do love to quote Bill Belichick, because he absolutely epitomized Bill Belichick's do your job. You know, don't worry about fame or what the guy next to you is doing or, you know, getting publicity for what you're doing, just do your job. And that's exactly what George Boutwell did.
I think that's, well, okay, I have one more question and then we'll cut to your reading.
Sure.
And this is going back to, that's just so inspirational what you just said. Going back to the Anti-Imperialist League and what was going on at the time of Teddy Roosevelt. A question from our audience: wasn't anti-annexation a racist sentiment? People did not want to have more Black and brown people as citizens. Although you said Cuba was maybe different, people wanted it as another state, but please
Right.
answer the question.
Great question and absolutely correct. The Anti-Imperialist League, as I said, was a real motley crew, really diverse group of people. You had William James, Jane Addams, Andrew Carnegie. You also had people like Ben Pitchfork Tillman,
No kidding.
senator from South Carolina,
Sure, huh.
who was an anti-imperialist precisely for those reasons.
Huh.
He didn't want America to take control over, you know, the Asian hordes or whatever, the yellow peoples of Asia. So there was a strong anti or racist element to the Anti-Imperialist League, epitomized most by David Starr Jordan, president of Stanford University, who then became, or at the time, was a proponent of eugenics. So there were all kinds of, you know, strange bedfellows in the Anti-Imperialist League. George, you know, was not opposing it for those reasons, but many others were. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, getting back to the heart of our talk tonight, as we do for all our authors in the American Inspiration Author Series, we've asked Jeffrey to read from his book a final passage, and then we'll come back with some more information. But over to you, sir.
Great. Well, this is easy. I looked around for various passages and I couldn't do better than the one that ends the book, my final paragraph. I hope people will agree. George Boutwell lived in a momentous period of American history. He helped reformulate the concepts of citizenship, voting, and equality before the law as necessary pillars of representative democracy in a multiracial society, whether in America or its overseas possessions. He believed that putting too much power into the hands of state governments had been a fundamental flaw of the original Constitution, a flaw which permitted slavery to grow, ignited the Civil War, and led to the difficulties of Reconstruction. Having helped write the 14th Amendment, he emphasized that Americans were, quote, first citizens of the United States and then citizens of the state wherein they reside, and declared these words were chosen with care. This was the original intent of the 14th Amendment. He believed that the protections of the US Constitution would be uniformly applied for all citizens, no matter their race, religion, or creed, or in which state they resided. Only by doing so could the ideals of the Declaration of Independence be fully realized for all Americans. That, for Boutwell, was the American promise, a goal worthy of continued struggle. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. Those are incredibly important words, and we so appreciate the look back. It's really remarkable. I do want to remind the audience online that, of course, a signed copy of Boutwell's book has been set aside for you. If you purchased one tonight, if you're with us in person, you can meet Jeffrey and get a copy. There's so much to learn there. If you've not yet ordered a book, you can do that from Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The link to their website is being put in the chat right now, and we'll be making sure that he signs some book plates, and we can send those to you anywhere in the United States. So please go look for those. And as we move toward closing, we want to thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure hosting you here. If you are researching a time in history, if you're researching a person like Boutwell, please come use our sources, our resources here at the Genealogical Center. Our Brew Family Learning Center hosts all sorts of programs for folks who are researching various times in history and various people. We run a lot of research trips to look at archives. There's just really something for each of your ancestors here. If you're out looking for them, we can help you find them. And free to the public, you can chat with one of our genealogists 5 days a week with your questions. Our members get the best service here. They can access online more than 1.4 billion records of family research and family history. And they can also use our library and our archives, which just opened. Our headquarters, you're in a brandy new space. You came marching right through. We're having our official opening in April. But please come back to see us. Our mission and all we do is to educate, inspire, and connect people through scholarship, through our collections, and through our expertise, and through the expertise of our authors. And for you book and history lovers, please join us at these upcoming talks. On March 19, we're welcoming back a superstar of the transcendental period, Megan Marshall, the Pulitzer Prize winning biographer of Margaret Fuller, the Peabody sisters, and Elizabeth Bishop. Professor Marshall will present her new book, a memoir, Afterlives. And on April 1, we're hosting a special virtual panel called The Power of Learning Your Family History. This discussion features two authors, the journalist newscaster Lee Hawkins and also Professor Martha S. Jones, whose book, The Trouble of Color, was reviewed in today's New York Times. And it's reviewed by Thavolia Glimpf, the Duke historian, who will be interviewing her and Lee Hawkins on that night. So hear from Martha S. Jones, Lee Hawkins, the journalist newscaster. His book is called I Am Nobody's Slave. And we'll be looking at the issue of race in this country and identity. And then on April 17, in a ticketed event, we're welcoming two masterful historians, Alan Pell Crawford and Joseph J. Ellis. They're going to discuss Professor Crawford's new book, This Fierce People, The Untold Story of America's Revolutionary War in the South. His premise is that the war ended in the South, and there's no accident that it ended at Yorktown. That really what happened between Monmouth and Yorktown is really the central battle. And that's interesting to hear when we are also geared toward Lexington and Concord and Trenton and the Hessians and. So anyway, it's a very interesting dialogue between Professors Ellis and also Alan Pell Crawford. But back to tonight, thank you so much, both of you, for enlightening that time period for us. And we hope all of you will join us soon again in person or online. Gentlemen, thank you. Another round of applause.